Back in the early 2000s when I started collecting coins, it always struck me as odd that when I plugged into the GDP calculators, see, when I started collecting coins, silver was about $4 an ounce. I remember it because I remember you could buy 40% silver half dollars for just a smudge over 50 cents. I distinctly remember that because I thought that was a very low risk investment. But when I plugged into the inflation calculators, silver seemed to have kept up with inflation since the 1960s, but gold went well above inflation. And it always struck me as odd that gold had gone up so much relative to inflation, because it didn't seem like people were wearing a lot of gold on them. I mean, we might have been using a little bit more of it in electronics, but we were using a lot more silver in electronics. I didn't realize it at the time, but we were being lied to with our inflation figures. So a common statistic I sometimes hear is that our incomes stopped rising in somewhere in mid-1970, in the mid-1970s, and it has just barely kept up with inflation. But even then, I feel kind of lied to. I mean, just go talk to your parents or your grandparents, and if you do the exact same thing as your parents or your grandparents, you have nowhere near the kind of lifestyle, right? There's no way you could raise a family on one income doing the exact same thing for the same exact number of hours as your family members from times past, right? If you just barely kept up with inflation, you should be able to live in the same area, right? You shouldn't have to work remotely and move a few states away where it's less expensive, or even have to move to a third world country and work remotely at the same job that your parents or grandparents used to do back home and live in the city, right? That doesn't, or better yet, in a good suburb with a good school district, right? That doesn't make sense, right? If you only kept up with inflation, that means you're getting the same real stuff, right? Which kind of implied that we were being lied to, right? This is real median full-time male income, so adjusted for inflation based on your CPI calculators, which is what they use to adjust inflation for Social Security and for your tax brackets, right? Now, what if we looked at median full-time income relative to how many ounces of gold, right? So back in 1971, a median male full-time income per year was 250 ounces of gold, right? Which today would be worth 250 times what is gold right now? $2,000 an ounce at least. So imagine your median male full-time income being $500,000 a year today, right? If we had only kept up with inflation, right? Not to mention all the increased productivity, not to mention the fact that a lot of people have to juggle multiple jobs nowadays, right? And instead we're making on average 40 or 50 ounces of gold per year, right? And about the same amount of gold as we used to make during the peak of the Hunt brothers right here, right? Without gold being in a bubble, right? So I'll let you do the math of how much you have lost. And it makes sense, right? So it looks like you've lost 80%. That's why you have to work 2 jobs and you have to work remotely and live in the third world nowadays, just to live the same kind of lifestyle that your parents used to live in the suburbs, right? Although I'd argue there's a lot of benefits to living in the third world, right? Now, what about U.S. per capita GDP in ounces, right? So GDP has grown per capita, right? If you take all of the bottoms, right? Obviously, gold has swung very wildly in recent decades, but I'll let you extrapolate between 1933, where GDP was about 16 ounces of gold or so, and it was up to 20 in 1980, and in 2011 it was 40. So in 30 years it doubled, right? So if we get out the calculator, if you're doubling every 30 years, right? If you take 2, which is double, and you want to divide that out in 30 years. So you're going to raise that to the power of 1/30th, right? What number to the power of 30, right? Compounded every year gives you 2, right? So to the power of 1/30th, and this will tell us how much on average GDP, real GDP per capita is growing per year. It's growing about 2.3%, right? Not the 5 or 8% that we hear about on the news, right? And we're being lied to about inflation, which is making a lot of things worse, right? Aside from the fact that our real income hasn't really kept up with GDP, our tax brackets are going up. Or our tax brackets are not going up fast enough because inflation is a lot higher than they tell us, and so we're paying much higher taxes, right? I wouldn't be surprised, even with all the Reagan and Bush and Trump tax cuts, that the average American is paying a higher rate of tax, apples to apples, right? If they were making the same real income, which they are not, right? And then your Social Security benefits are being cut, right? Even with all the expansions in Social Security, not to mention the fact that they are being cut in nominal terms because the retirement age has gone up a few times since Ronald Reagan. The qualifications, if you're disabled, have gotten more stringent since Reagan. Not to mention that, but the fact that inflation is being understated further cuts into the benefits, right?